Hello, I'm Alicia Berthium from Environment and Climate Change Canada, where I work on the National Pollutant Release Inventory, or NPRI. My talk today will present an overview of how NPRI data on pollutants and waste can be used to measure progress towards Sustainable Development Goal, or SDG 12, ensuring responsible production and consumption. Just to note before I start, this work has been recently published as 3 separate research papers, so full details are available at the links shown here. First, a bit of background on the NPRI. It is Canada's national PRTR, and it's administered by Environment and Climate Change Canada under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. There are currently over 300 substances on the NPRI at various reporting thresholds, and in recent years, roughly 7,000 facilities report to NPRI each year. The figure on the right here describes the categories of data that the NPRI collects, and I'll just draw your attention to the fact that NPRI also collects information on the offsite destination locations for transfers. So we can use that to see where waste is going. And of course, all the data is publicly accessible, and here are a few links. And while the term sustainability can mean a lot of things in a lot of contexts, for today's talk, when I say it, I mean the sound management of chemicals and waste. And that's leveraged from the SDG 12, which I'll paraphrase here by saying, while chemicals play an important part in modern society, their sound management means they're produced and consumed in ways that minimize their release to air, water, land, and waste, and thus minimize adverse impacts on the environment and human health. And with this definition, it's clear that NPRI and other PRTRs with their data on chemical releases to air, water, land, and waste are a good fit as indicators of sustainability, especially for SDG 12. However, here we have the official indicators for SDG 12, and so you'll note for indicator 12.4, there are no direct or absolute measurements of chemical releases and waste quantities, nor their environmental or human impacts. Instead, the focus is on the number of parties that report information prescribed by the international multilateral agreements listed here, and nothing about the content of those reports. So there's a gap in information between how many parties report versus the content of what's been reported, and PRTRs can help fill that gap. Indeed, as you surely know, the OECD has established a framework for using PRTRs in sustainability analysis, and that's covered by the 3 publications at right here. And so we can see using this conceptual framework at left that the NPRI can inform snapshots and trends of chemical releases and their movement in waste towards being able to conduct more sophisticated analysis, such as characterizing transboundary movement of pollutants, evaluating environmental policy performance, among others. But despite this clear role in the availability of PRTR data, we found in Canada that research efforts so far have mainly focused on air and water data, whereas data on transfers and disposals has rarely been used. And we know this thanks to a literature review that identified who's using NPRI and how over the last 25 years, and this gap showed up. So this project is about seizing some of those opportunities and addressing that gap. So the work had 2 objectives. The first was to produce a basic characterization of what's in the transfer and disposal dataset, really just to raise awareness of what's there, but also to set the stage for using the data to see what it can tell us about, what NPRI can tell us about SDG 12 progress. And so for part 1 in the basic characterization, one of the main novel aspects of this characterization was the creation of route maps between the facility of origin and the destination of offsite transfers. This type of information, like I mentioned before, has been collected by the NPRI over time, but it hasn't been well used. And so now by mapping it, we're trying to make it much more usable. For example, this slide shows where all of the offsite recycling has gone in the last 10 years. So it's broken down by recycling subtype. And you can see fairly easily at a glance that certain types of recycling transfers go to multi-continental destinations. So for example, recovery of acids and bases and recovery of metals. But for the most part, these appear to stay within North America, if not within Canada. So NPRI is currently working on a public dashboard of this information, but in the meantime, there is a prototype available at the link shown here. For part 2 of this work, I wanted to show how NPRI transfers and disposal data could be used in more advanced SDG analysis. So in the paper, I discussed 2 international agreements named in the official SDG 12 indicator, namely the Basel Convention and the Minamatic Convention, to see how NPRI could provide insights into transboundary movement of pollutants and waste, and thus the performance of these environmental policies. But in the interest of time, I'll only present one case study on the Basel Convention, which generally has the aim to minimize the generation of hazardous waste, prevent the international movement of waste to waste havens, which are less developed countries that don't have the regs or capacity to manage hazardous waste soundly, and third, to ensure that waste is kept as close as possible to the source, keeping in mind the need for environmentally sound disposal. So per the official SDG 12.4 indicator, which as you recall tracks the reporting compliance of member parties, Canada has a record of 100% compliance. So by that indicator, sustainability is fully on track. However, there's a more nuanced story to be told here. Something to note is that while Canada, like other Basel members, implements regulations that systematically track information on the movement of waste, this data isn't publicly accessible, and it only tracks movement of waste by class. So a view of the cross-border movements of pollutants themselves is not possible through these manifests. Such a view is possible through PRTR data though, and so here I looked at all of the transboundary pollutant movements in the NPRI over 2013 to 2022, and I found a few useful insights shown in the figure here. For example, of the 19 nations receiving industrial pollutants and waste from Canada over the last 10 years, all are Basel compliant, meaning these transfers are going to Basel member countries, which are in orange, or the US, which is in blue, who's not a Basel member country, but with whom there is a bilateral agreement, so it's Basel compliant nonetheless, and meaning that according to the NPRI, no industrial pollutants and waste are going to waste havens. So that's good. That means the Basel Convention is working on that point, and the NPRI can show it. Another point is that the NPRI data show increasing trends over recent years in quantities of pollutants and waste transferred internationally. This insight suggests that the Convention's aim of minimizing transboundary hazardous waste volume hasn't transpired. And a third insight is that while the Basel Convention aims to keep waste closest to its source, so within the country of origin if it can be disposed of soundly, of the 23 substances being transferred internationally to Basel members, so not the US, those are in the orange bars, over the last 10 years, almost all had at least one matching domestic discard option, so those are the gray blocks. This raises the question as to why the waste was sent internationally when it appears as though it could have been dealt with domestically. The exception is thallium, which is in the yellow dotted line, which was only handled internationally for a few years. Most of these transfers were for recycling, so those are circled by the red dotted line. This means they may meet the Basel Convention exemption of being needed as raw material for recycling and recovery industries by the importing nation, and this is a valid reason to send waste internationally, but further verification is needed and beyond scope here. There were also 2 instances of potential Basel noncompliance found for lead and zinc disposals to landfill, and those are in the blue dotted line. In both cases, because as disposals, they don't qualify for the Basel recycling exception, and because landfill options were also apparently available in Canada, the justification for international transfer is questionable, but further verification is warranted and beyond scope. But it just goes to show what types of perspectives the NPRI transfers and disposals data can bring to SDG analysis, and shows that the Basel Convention aims may not be as fully on track as the official indicator suggests. Finally, part 2B of this work, further case studies were done, this time focusing on how the NPRI and other PRTRs could provide insights into human and ecosystem health issues. And the related topic of understanding the impacts of various waste management practices and looking for shifts towards preferred waste management practices. I don't have time to present these results today, but I am mentioning it as a bit of a tease, and suffice it to say that there is a gap within current risk estimation models to comprehensively account for the human and eco impacts of pollutants going to various on-site and off-site waste handling methods, and that advances to fill these gaps are needed to enable a more accurate view of these waste management types. So to conclude, the goal of this work was to raise awareness of NPRI transfer and disposal data and to showcase its usefulness in SDG 12 indicators. The results show that despite the official indicators suggesting Canada's 100% achievement of SDG 12 aims, NPRI data show a different perspective. Results also show that there are gaps in current impact assessment models that need to be filled before we can move more accurately understanding whether human or eco-impact reductions are being achieved. Nonetheless, NPRI and other PRTRs can complement existing official indicators and show these more detailed stories and better guide decision making to correct course. Thank you.